Hello and welcome back to Prophets of the Exile, Lamentations. So I hope you enjoyed reading the first poem of Lamentations yesterday and you had a better idea now of how Hebrew poetry works in terms of its structure. It's called free verse, and couplets are very common in Hebrew poetry, and it does the same thing as narrative poetry in that it retells or recounts events, but it has more of an emotional explosive experience to it. And that's what the author of Lamentations is trying to do here for us, is help us to get into the feeling of what they went through in 587 BC when Jerusalem was finally conquered and destroyed. So it's not a happy story, but there's a reason for the destruction of Jerusalem. And so today I want to go into that a little bit. Do you remember with inductive Bible study, we look at context, the author's context in terms of the history at the time, and also his own cultural context of the story that he's trying to tell. And so we need to do the backstory or the context of the Lamentations poems, and so that we can understand them. And remember, in inductive Bible study, we stay in the text unless the author refers to other texts from Scripture. So, like for instance, when we did the Luke study, when Jesus stands up before the synagogue for the first time and announces his ministry, he's actually reading the scroll of Isaiah. So in the inductive method, we're allowed to then go back and read the Isaiah passage so that we can understand, since Luke incorporated the Isaiah passage into his story. And the same thing here, we're allowed to go back and find out what the causes of the effects of the Lamentations are. So we can go back and look at the failure of Israel's leadership, their priests, their prophets, their kings, their elders, and we can go back and look at the transgressions that led up to this slow burn that Yahweh had until he finally destroyed Jerusalem. So that's what I want to do today. And the Old Testament, the entire New Testament and Old Testament, is really this cohesive, unified story of Yahweh and his kingdom. And the story begins way back in Genesis 12 when Abraham gets his promise that he's going to have so many children that they'll be like the stars of the sky or the sands of the beach, and so many you won't be able to count them, and that through him and his offspring all the nations of the world, of the earth, shall be blessed. And so that promise in Genesis 12, go find Genesis 12 with your finger. Just hold your finger there, if you will. That promise is played out through the people that Yahweh chooses to be his elect people. He calls Abraham. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. They throw his son Joseph in the pit, and he gets sold to slave traders, gets carried off to Egypt, and then he's exalted in Egypt as one of Pharaoh's highest advisors. He helps them through the famine, but then over the time of several hundred years, the population of Israel grows, and a new Pharaoh is in power then, and he doesn't feel the same way about the Israelites as the Pharaoh under Joseph, and so he enslaves them, and it's during that time that they cry out to Yahweh, and Yahweh hears their cry, and he sends Moses to go deliver them. And so that's the story of the Exodus. So we run from Genesis 12 to Exodus, through Exodus, and then of course after Moses turns the reins over to Joshua, Joshua takes them into the promised land, which is going to cover continuing on. We've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, which are covering that whole promise in the beginning and the calling out of the people, giving them the law, taking them to the promised land. And then Joshua takes over, and we go through the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and we then move from the people of the Exodus to the people of the land. They get the inherited land, the promised land that is right there along the Mediterranean, that we would now call Israel, although it was configured a little bit differently back then. And so if you were to put your fingers in your Bible, you could actually pinch the sections between Genesis and the end of the beginning of Deuteronomy and see that as one major segment. And then the next segment, as they're moving into the promised land from Joshua up to 2nd Kings, that's another segment. And so anyway, just real quickly, what happens is of course we know that Yahweh is their king. He's the one that delivered them in this cosmic battle with Pharaoh and took them out of Egypt, gave them a promise, a covenant that he was going to be their God and they were going to be his people. He gave them the plans for the tabernacle, which Moses and the people finally executed correctly. And that tabernacle went with them as they were traveling to the promised land. And you remember they were disobedient, and what would have been a 3-day journey took 40 years because Yahweh wanted to wait until the disobedient parents died and then take the children into the land. When they get to the land, Joshua is told that they need to execute the people that live in that land, and the land is then theirs. And it's during that time that the Israelites look around, they see their neighbors, the Philistines, the Canaanites, all the different tribes that are around them, and they see that they have kings. And they're not satisfied with having Yahweh as their king because, you can't see Yahweh. And these other kings are physical human beings, and they have, different types of idols that they worship as peoples, cultural peoples and all. And so, anyway, Israel looks around and they say, we want a king too. And through the prophet Samuel, Yahweh says, you really don't want a king. It's not going to go well with you with a human king, but he agrees to let them have a king. And so we have 3 kings in the United Kingdom. The first one is Saul, to remember him. And then we have David, and then we have Solomon. And after those 3 kings are established, Solomon builds a temple to Yahweh. David wants to build a temple and replace the tabernacle, the temporary tent, with a beautiful temple. And just like all the other their neighbors who have temples for their gods. And so Yahweh allows Solomon to build a temple, and that's the first temple that is going to get destroyed in the Babylonian invasion several hundred years later. But anyway, what happened was that there was some conflict, and what was a united kingdom under Solomon became a divided kingdom, which we now call the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. There were 10 tribes in the Northern Kingdom and 2 tribes in the Southern Kingdom. And so we're going to go back to 2 passages so that you can see what the transgressions were that built up over time that Yahweh is now judging at the time of Lamentations, when the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is destroyed. Okay, so if you'll go to 2 Kings 17, I want to read that to you. 2 Kings 17, and it's kind of long, but I think you need to see the whole thing. It's verses 1 through 23, and the 10 tribes of Israel were carried off by Assyria in 721 BC. So this is kind of the backstory of that. So we have 2 Kings, let me make sure I'm there, 17, 1 through 23. Okay. In the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. He reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria came up against him. Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to King So of Egypt and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria confined him and imprisoned him. Verse 5. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Halah on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Verse 7. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel secretly did things that were not right against Yahweh their God. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom Yahweh carried away before them. They did wicked things, provoking Yahweh to anger. They served idols, of which the Yahweh had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law that I commanded your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets." They would not listen, but were stubborn, as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in Yahweh their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their ancestors and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false. They followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom Yahweh had commanded them that they should not do as they did. They rejected all the commandments of Yahweh their God and made for themselves cast images of golden calves. They made a sacred pole, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. They made their sons and daughters pass through fire. They used divination and augury, and they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. Therefore, Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. Judah also did not keep the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. Though Yahweh rejected all the descendants of Israel, he punished them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam son of Nebat king. Jeroboam drove Israel from following Yahweh and made them commit great sins. The people of Israel continued in all the sins that Jeroboam committed. They did not depart from them until Yahweh removed Israel out of his sight, as he had foretold through all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. Okay, so there's the backstory on the 10 tribes out of the 12 tribes, the 10 northern tribes. They pushed their limits. They continued to disobey Yahweh. They had idols. They did child sacrifice, all kinds of terrible things. And finally Yahweh said, "That's it. I'm going to allow king of Assyria to come in and take you away." And he took them away into Assyria. He left some there and brought in some Assyrians there, some of the other people that he had conquered, and they intermarried. And that is the people that we now call Samaritans in the New Testament, or the mixed blood, people who used to be part of the 10 tribes of Israel and intermarried with some Assyrians and other peoples from other nations. So the 12 tribes that started out as 10 tribes was quickly reduced to 2 tribes, because now 10 tribes are gone, and they're completely gone now. So that gives you some idea of the sins, and it does reflect back to this idea of Israel, the widow, the mourning widow, and in Lamentations 1, her sin being in her skirts, and her lovers not being there for her anymore because she decided to worship other idols and be unfaithful to Yahweh, and to have alliances with King of Egypt and some of the other people that were their neighbors that they shouldn't have been in alliance with. So that gives you an idea on the northern kingdom's transgressions and their failure to obey. Now go to 2 Kings 21, and we will look at Israel, or Judah is the southern kingdom, look at their transgressions. So chapter 21 of 2 Kings, verses 1 through 16. Now, you probably have heard of King Hezekiah. So Manasseh is his son, and we start chapter 21 with Manasseh. Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, following the abominable practices of the nations that Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal, made a sacred pole as King Ahab of Israel had done, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served them. He built altars in the house of Yahweh, of which Yahweh had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." He built altars for all the host of heaven in the 2 courts of the house of Yahweh. He made his son pass through fire. He practiced soothsaying and augury, and dealt with mediums and with wizards. He did much evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. The carved image of Asherah that he had made, he set in the house of which Yahweh said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land that I gave to their ancestors, if only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them." But they did not listen. Manasseh misled them to do more evil than the nations that had done before, that Yahweh destroyed before the people of Israel. Yahweh said to his servants, the prophets, because King Manasseh of Judah has committed these abominations, has done these things more wicked than all that the Amorites did who were before him, and has caused Judah to sin with his idols, therefore, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such evil that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line for Samaria and the plummet for the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will cast off the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies. They shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what was evil in my sight, and have provoked me to anger, since the day their ancestors came out of Egypt, even to this day. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood, until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides the sin that he caused Judah to sin, so that they did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. And then we have Manasseh's son who reigns, and then his grandson Josiah, who is a good king. And we're going to talk about Josiah tomorrow as we continue this context. But I just wanted to give you an idea. People who just look at Lamentations and say, whoa, that is not my God. That's not Jesus there. He is mean. They don't understand that Yahweh is suffering as much as the people. Sorry about that. My phone is going off. They don't understand that Yahweh is suffering at the unfaithfulness of his people, and that he warned them through all of his prophets that if they didn't get in line and obey, there would be consequences. And so that's where we're going to leave it today. And I apologize again about the phone, but I will catch up with you tomorrow, okay?